But the governments of Belgium, the governments of France, and the government of the United States of America paralyzed the United Nations, which abandoned a UN peacekeeping force that was already on the ground. And each of these governments, Belgium, France, and the United States, knowingly pursued their foreign policies through genocide. Now, theirs is a complicity that is revealed by the remarks of then President Mitterrand of France, who said to an aide in the summer of 1994, quote, "Genocide is irrelevant in such places." Ladies and gentlemen, the genocide was politics as we can choose, and as we did choose to live. Now, how do you have hope in the face of a genocide? How do you see possibility? Well, it doesn't lie in naive utopian dreams, but it lies in what we do. Hannah Arendt, a Jew who as a young woman escaped the Nazi Reich to France and then to New York, was one of the great political philosophers of the 20th century. She said, and I quote, "The first political act is to speak." Now, many have described genocide and similar human cruelties as unspeakable, but these are as unspeakable as they are undoable. As human beings, we do genocide, and doctors cannot stop this crime. The little girl that I told you about, she had no voice, but we had a responsibility to speak out against what we knew. And we did speak. We spoke with a clear intent to rouse the outrage of public consciousness around the world and to demand a politics that pursues justice by putting the dignity of the victim at its center. Now, if there is silence, there can be no justice. And revenge, the lowest form of justice, but a form of justice nonetheless, is the only certainty. And this is why organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, and a legion of others continue to press worldwide for the arrest of alleged perpetrators of genocide and war crimes in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. And it's why we pressed for the ratification of the International Criminal Court, and why MSF today still presses and presses publicly for investigations into the culpability of the French government for its actions and for its inactions in 1994. Now, Hannah Arendt also wrote that, quote, "We are not born equal. Equality and equity are the result of choice and of human organization." Now, the basic principle of equity is that people in similar situations should be treated similarly. It requires that no distinction exist in treatment on grounds such as race, gender, ethnicity, religion, or economic status. Now, for billions of people today, the lack of equity is a politically determined choice. In our world today of about 6.5 billion people, 3.8 billion, more than half of all of the people on the planet, live on less than $2 a day. This sea of excluded humanity lives increasingly in the unplanned urban barrios and slums of the developing world, where basic food, housing, water, sanitation, not to mention schooling, stable employment, or healthcare services, all of which are central to any basic notion of human dignity, all of these are absent in all but the most elemental of ways. Today in the West, life expectancy is 80 years. In Africa, it is 39 years. Around the world, 2 billion people have no access to life-saving essential medicines. And last year, 840 million people worldwide went to bed hungry every single night. Now, in much of Africa, agriculture remains the main economic activity, and agricultural products are the key source of export trade. The average rural household spends 80% of its income, 80% of its $2 per person per day on food. Vast rural populations survive literally hand to mouth on subsistence farming. There is no surplus. There is no coping capacity. In April of this year, the World Food Program went begging among donor states so as to cope with an additional 100 million people added to that 840 million that are being pushed into hunger and starvation because of rising food commodity prices. That very week, Bears and Stearns got a $700 million bailout from the U.S. government. Now, as the G20 states met in Washington only 3 weeks ago, globally, some nearly 8 trillion taxpayer dollars from around the world has been mobilized to underwrite a collapsing international financial architecture. And the World Food Program has received a mere $2 billion of the $22 billion it needs to feed what are now 967 million hungry people around the world. Now, today we face a food crisis, a fuel crisis, a financial crisis that may yet be catastrophic, and a climate crisis that has begun to change our planet in ominous ways. All have global causes and local consequences that are imposed on people who, through no action or fault of their own, are suffering consequences that are profound and profoundly unfair. And frankly, it would be very surprising to me if these didn't provoke instability, if they didn't provoke violence, if they didn't provoke bases of terrorism and the like. And unsurprisingly, they are provoking these very things. Now, just how are we to pursue equity in this kind of context? Well, humanitarianism is a beginning, but it's not enough. Humanitarianism is about direct and immediate actions that seek to relieve human suffering. And the drive for equity is rooted, for me, in a solidarity that emerges from our common dignity as human beings. And the humanitarian act is rooted in the experience of compassion as solidarity. And solidarity is not the same thing as compassion. Solidarity derives from compassion, but in a very particular way. And too often, we see the suffering of others as somehow separate from ourselves. And we can choose to take pity on those who suffer. And sometimes we can choose to take charitable actions towards the relief of that suffering. However, when one literally sees the other as equal in worth and in dignity as the self, then compassion leads not to pity or simply charity, but solidarity that works with people to relieve suffering. It's a solidarity that takes human suffering seriously and that refuses to accept the unacceptable. Now, while I believe firmly in the rightness of humanitarianism, I also believe firmly in the power and the rightness and the necessity of a legitimate politics. And not the world of political platitudes, but the politics of real debate that changes the terms of reference, that changes the possibilities of imagined solutions, and that leads to real choice and to real transformation. Now, in January of 2000, I was in South Africa at a MSF clinic. It was an AIDS clinic, and I was examining a 20-year-old man. And if he were here in Cleveland or virtually anywhere else in the Western world, he would be just starting his life. But there his life was nearly over. He had AIDS and weighed less than 100 pounds. And patented drugs at that time to treat AIDS were available in the Western world, but at a cost of more than $15,000 a year for treatment per patient, there wasn't a hope in hell that anyone in the developing world would get those drugs. The young man was so weak that his mother and his grandmother had to help him onto the examining table. And as he sat gasping for air, he asked me some very simple questions, questions that get to the heart of inequity around the HIV/AIDS epidemic. He asked me, "Why do you come here with only kindness when what I need is medicine to stop this AIDS? Your kindness is good, but it will not help this AIDS. They have such medicines in your countries. Why not here in South Africa for people like me?" Well, as you know, AIDS is a fully treatable disease, as treatable as diabetes. And AIDS is not just an African problem. The Caribbean, India, China, and much of Asia are still in the midst of an HIV explosion.